They didn't say a word. Danny just looked at me across the table, the roast still steaming between us, and said, "Dad, Melissa's parents are staying with us for the season. We need you to move your things out of the guest suite by Friday." He said it like he was reading me a weather report. Not a request, not even an apology. An announcement delivered to a man who had built that house's frame with his own 2 hands 11 years ago, back when Danny couldn't afford a contractor and didn't know yet that his father would quietly become the reason he could afford anything at all. Melissa sat beside him, cutting her chicken into small, careful pieces, not looking up. Her mother, Diane, examined her wine glass like it had personally offended her. Gerald, her father, cleared his throat and studied the ceiling fan with sudden, deep interest. My grandson Tyler, 16 years old, sat frozen with his fork halfway to his mouth, his eyes moving from his father to me and back again, waiting for someone, anyone, to say this wasn't happening. I set my fork down slowly. I didn't slam it. I didn't raise my voice. I have spent 62 years learning that the men who shout are usually the ones with nothing left to stand on, and I still had plenty left to stand on, even if none of them at that table knew it yet. "The guest suite," I repeated. "It's just for a few months," Danny said, already backpedaling in that soft, apologetic tone he used whenever he knew he was wrong, but had already decided not to change course. "Gerald and Diane are renovating their place in Charleston. It only makes sense for them to have the space. You understand." I looked at my son, really looked at him the way you look at a stranger's face when you're trying to place where you've seen them before. Because in that moment, I didn't recognize him. This was not the boy who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat of my truck on the drive home from Little League, his cleats still on, dust from second base still on his knees. This was a 34-year-old man asking his widowed father to pack a suitcase and vacate a room in a house that existed, in every meaningful sense, because of him. "I understand," I said. Diane finally looked up, offering me a smile so practiced it barely moved her cheeks. "Robert, it's not permanent. And honestly, it might be good for you to get out and stay somewhere new for a while. Shake things up a little." I have never in my life wanted so badly to laugh in someone's face at a dinner table. Instead, I nodded once, folded my napkin, and set it beside my plate the way Ruth used to do when she decided a conversation was finished before anyone else at the table had realized it. "I'll be out by Friday," I said. Tyler's fork clattered against his plate. "Grandpa, it's fine, Ty." I reached over and squeezed his shoulder. It wasn't fine. But a 16-year-old boy didn't need to carry that weight at a dinner table where the adults were too busy protecting their own comfort to notice they were breaking something in front of him. I want you to understand something before I go any further, because it matters more than anything else in this story. I am not a bitter man. I did not raise my son to be cruel, and I don't believe, even now, that cruelty was ever truly in his heart. What was in his heart was fear, fear of Melissa's disappointment, fear of the Ashfords' quiet, condescending judgment, fear of being seen, once again, as the boy who married beneath his station and needed his father's help to make it work. Danny had spent his whole marriage trying to prove to people who would never be satisfied that he belonged among them. And somewhere along the way, he decided that the easiest thing to sacrifice, the safest place to cut, was me, that night, sitting on the edge of the guest bed that had been mine in that house for 3 years. Since Ruth passed, I did not cry. I did not call anyone to complain. I sat very still the way I used to sit in my truck outside job sites at the end of long days, and I let the quiet tell me what I already knew. I opened the drawer of the nightstand and took out the small wooden toolbox Ruth had given me for our 30th anniversary, the one I never used for tools, the one where I kept the things that actually mattered. Inside, beneath the folded photograph of Ruth on our wedding day, was a manila folder I hadn't opened in over a year. I want to tell you what was in that folder. But not yet, because if I tell you now, you won't understand why it mattered so much when it finally came out into the light, in front of the very people who thought they knew exactly who Robert Hale was and exactly how much he was worth. My name is Robert Hale. I'm 62 years old. For 36 years, I ran a small contracting company out of a workshop behind my house. Additions, restorations, custom cabinetry. The kind of work that doesn't make you rich but makes you known. The kind where people still stop you at the hardware store 15 years later to tell you the porch you built them survived 3 hurricanes. My wife Ruth died 4 years ago, breast cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the funeral, and in that time I learned more about what a man is actually made of than in the 60 years before it combined. My son Danny is my only child, and until that dinner, I would have told you, without hesitation, that there was nothing on this earth I wouldn't do for him. That, it turns out, was exactly the problem. Let me take you back further, because you need to understand what the guest suite actually meant and why Friday's deadline landed on me like a physical blow rather than a mere inconvenience. 11 years ago, Danny came to me with a face I recognized instantly, because I had worn it myself once, decades earlier, sitting across from my own father. It was the face of a man who needs help and hates himself for needing it. He and Melissa had found a house, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial on Ridgeline Drive, good school district, the kind of address that meant something to people like the Ashfords. But Danny's finances were still recovering from his first marriage, the one to Karen that had ended 2 years earlier with a settlement that gutted his savings and left a stain on his credit that no bank in the county was willing to overlook. Melissa's parents had offered to help, but with strings. Strings that would have meant Gerald's name on the deed, Gerald's opinions in every renovation decision, Gerald reminding Danny at every Thanksgiving for the rest of his life exactly whose money had built the walls around him. Danny didn't want that, and frankly, neither did I. So I made him an offer he didn't expect. I would loan him the difference, $150,000, as a private note, structured properly through my lawyer and old friend, Walt Brennan's brother-in-law Marcus, a real estate attorney 2 towns over, below market interest, no balloon payments, no public record beyond what was legally required, filed quietly, discreetly, the kind of paperwork that exists, but that nobody ever thinks to go looking for unless they know precisely what to search. In exchange, Danny made one promise, and one promise only, that this stayed between us. Not because I was ashamed of helping my son, but because I knew Melissa, and more importantly, I knew her parents. And I understood that if the Ashfords ever learned the truth, that their son-in-law's beautiful colonial on Ridgeline Drive existed because of a retired contractor's savings account, and not because of Danny's own hard-won success, it would change the way they looked at him forever. It would hand them a weapon they would use, consciously or not, for the rest of his life. I wanted better for my son than that. I wanted him to walk into every room with the Ashfords believing he belonged there on his own merit, because as far as they knew he did for 11 years that secret held. Danny made his payments faithfully, wired directly to an account Marcus managed, and I never once brought it up at a holiday table, never once used it as leverage, never once let it slip, not even the year Gerald made a snide comment about young men these days expecting handouts while carving the Thanksgiving turkey. Not even the year Diane asked me, with poorly disguised curiosity, how a handyman managed to help his son buy such a lovely home. I sat there and smiled and said nothing, because that was the deal I'd made with myself the day I signed those papers. My son's dignity mattered more to me than my own credit. But dignity, I learned that Friday, is not something you can protect for a person who has stopped protecting yours. I packed my things that week, not in anger, but with a strange, cold clarity I hadn't felt since the week after Ruth's funeral, when I'd had to sort through her closet and decide what stayed and what went. I filled 2 suitcases and 3 boxes. I left the framed photo of Danny's Little League team on the guest room dresser because somehow it felt wrong to take it, wrong to strip every trace of myself from a house I had, in every way that mattered, helped build twice, once with lumber and nails when the roof needed replacing 3 years ago, and once with $150,000 nobody at that table knew about. On Thursday night, my old friend Walt Brennan came by to help me load the truck. Walt had been a patrol officer for 26 years before he retired, lives 2 streets over from where I used to live, and has known me since before Danny was born. Walt doesn't say much, but when he does, it tends to land like a hammer on a nail that's been waiting its whole life to be struck. "You gonna tell him?" Walt asked, hauling a box of Ruth's old books into the truck bed. "About the note?" No, I said. Why not? Man ought to know what he's sitting on. Because if I tell him now, it looks like a threat. Like I'm holding it over him because he hurt my feelings. I closed the tailgate. I'm not interested in threatening my son, Walt. I'm interested in finding out who he is when nobody's holding his hand. Walt studied me for a long moment, the way he used to study a scene before deciding whether it was as simple as it looked. You're a stubborn old fool, Robert Hale, he said finally. Always have been, but you're not wrong very often. I laughed for the first time in 3 days. We'll see. Friday morning, I drove away from Ridgeline Drive with everything I owned in the back of a 15-year-old pickup truck and no destination beyond a motel off Route 9 that took cash and didn't ask questions. I did not tell Danny where I was going. I did not answer when Melissa texted 3 days later a single line that read, "Hope you're settling in okay somewhere." I stared at that message for a long time, at the breezy cruelty of its casualness, the way it managed to acknowledge that I'd been displaced, while treating it as no more significant than a change in weather. And then I set the phone face down on the motel nightstand and didn't pick it back up until morning. It was Sam who found me the small house by the lake. Sam Ortiz had been my apprentice for 6 years, ever since he walked into my workshop at 19 years old with nothing but a GED and a desperate need to learn something with his hands. Something that would let him build a life instead of just surviving one. His own father had walked out when he was 11, and somewhere along the way, without either of us ever naming it out loud, I had become something like the father he never had, and he had become something like the son I thought I already had. Sam texted me a listing 2 days after I left Ridgeline Drive, a small 2-bedroom cabin on Miller's Lake, 2 hours north, with a covered porch facing the water and a detached shed just big enough to set up a proper workbench. Saw this and thought of you, he wrote. Figured you might want somewhere quiet. I drove up that same afternoon. The cabin smelled like cedar and old wood smoke, the kind of smell that gets into a house's bones and never quite leaves. And the moment I stepped onto that porch and looked out over the water, something in my chest loosened for the first time since Ruth died. I bought it 3 days later, cash, from savings I'd kept separate my entire life for exactly this kind of moment. The moment when a man needs to know he can still choose his own life, even at 62, even after everything. I want to be honest with you. I did not buy that cabin out of spite. I bought it because I needed, more than I had ever needed anything, to remember what it felt like to make a decision that belonged entirely to me. Danny didn't call for 11 days. I know because I counted, not out of self-pity, but out of the same clear-eyed honesty I'd promised myself in that motel room. I was going to watch, carefully and without illusion, to see exactly who my son was when there was no dinner table to perform at, no audience of Ashfords to impress, nothing but the truth of whether he actually missed his father or simply missed the convenience of him. When he finally did call, it wasn't to apologize. It was because Marcus, my lawyer, had sent the quarterly statement on the private mortgage note, the one that, for 11 years, had gone straight to an account Danny checked without ever really looking at the sender information, filed under a name he'd never bothered to trace back. This time, for reasons I would only understand later, Danny actually looked. "Dad," he said, and his voice had a strange, unsteady quality I hadn't heard since he was a boy waking up from a nightmare. "What is this? What is Hale Family Holdings, LLC? Why does it have your lawyer's contact information on it?" I sat on my new porch, looking out at the lake, and I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to understand that I wasn't going to make this easy. "Come up here," I said. "I'll show you." "Dad." "Just tell me over the phone." "Come up here, Danny," I said again, quieter this time, and something in my voice must have carried the full weight of everything I'd been holding for 11 years, because he didn't argue. "Okay," he said. "I'll come Saturday." But Saturday, as it turned out, was not going to be a quiet conversation between a father and a son on a lake house porch, because on Thursday night, Diane Ashford called an emergency family dinner to celebrate what she was calling, with breathless pride, Danny's incredible achievement, the news, spreading through her social circle like wildfire, that Danny and Melissa had just paid off their mortgage in full, years ahead of schedule, and Diane wanted the whole family together to toast to her son-in-law's remarkable self-made success, which meant, of course, that someone had gone digging through the payoff paperwork, and someone had found my name. Marcus called me Friday morning, his voice tight in a way I'd never heard from a man who'd spent 30 years in real estate law without breaking a sweat over anything. "Robert," he said, "I need to tell you something before this gets out of your control. Melissa's father requested a copy of the payoff documents for the celebration dinner. Standard closing paperwork. Danny's assistant pulled the file to print it for the toast. And my name is on it," I said. It wasn't a question. "Hale Family Holdings, LLC, is listed as the note holder on every page, Robert, along with the original loan date. 11 years ago." Marcus paused. "They're going to know tomorrow night in front of everyone exactly who built that house." I sat with that for a long moment on my porch, the lake flat and silver in the early light, a heron picking its way along the shoreline the way it did every morning, unbothered by anything happening in my life or anyone else's. I had spent 11 years protecting my son from a truth that I believed at the time would diminish him in the eyes of people who had never deserved the privilege of judging him. And now that truth was going to walk into a celebration dinner on its own, without my permission, without my careful framing, in the worst possible way. Not as an act of quiet generosity revealed with dignity, but as a scandal, a gotcha, a humiliation dressed up as a toast. "I'm coming," I told Marcus. "To the dinner?" "To the dinner." I hadn't been invited. Nobody in that family had thought, even for a second, to include the man who'd been exiled from a guest bedroom 3 weeks earlier in a celebration of the very house he'd made possible. But I was done letting other people decide when my presence mattered. Saturday evening, I put on the navy sweater Ruth had given me 2 Christmases before she died, the one I usually saved for church, and I drove the 2 hours back down from the lake to the Ashford's sprawling house in the gated community outside Charleston, the one with the circular driveway and the topiary shaped like spirals that always struck me as trying a little too hard. Sam offered to come with me. I told him no. This wasn't a fight I needed backup for. This was something I needed to walk into alone, the way I'd walked into every hard thing in my life since Ruth passed. With my back straight and my hands steady, the way a man walks into a room when he has nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. I could hear the laughter and the clink of glasses from the driveway before I even reached the front door. Through the tall windows, I could see them all gathered in the great room. Danny in a blazer he never would have owned before he married into this family. Melissa beside him, glowing with the particular pride of a woman who believes her husband's success reflects well on her own choices. Diane holding court near the fireplace with a glass of champagne. Gerald cutting into what looked like a celebratory cake with the Ashford family crest piped onto it in gold icing because of course it did. Tyler sat off to one side on a leather ottoman, scrolling his phone, looking like a boy who'd rather be anywhere else. I rang the doorbell. The housekeeper answered, blinked at me with visible confusion, and went to fetch Melissa, who arrived at the door with a smile that dropped the instant she registered who was standing on the porch. "Robert," she said. We weren't expecting you." "I know," I said. "May I come in?" Behind her, I watched the room slowly notice. One guest at a time, the way a pawn notices a stone dropped into it. First the ripple near the door, then Danny turning, his face going through 3 distinct expressions in the space of 2 seconds. Surprise, panic, and something that looked almost like relief, though I wouldn't understand why until much later. "Dad," he said, crossing the room. "What are you doing here?" "I heard there was a celebration," I said. "I thought I'd come see what everyone was so proud of." Diane's smile had the brittle quality of ice about to crack. "Robert, this really isn't the—" "I'll only stay a few minutes," I said, and I walked past her into the great room, past the fireplace, past the cake with its gold crest, until I was standing in the center of that beautiful house I had never once been invited to see completed, though I had signed the papers that let it exist. "I understand congratulations are in order," I said. "The mortgage is paid off. That's wonderful news, Danny. Truly." Gerald cleared his throat, that same performative throat clearing from the dinner 3 weeks ago, and lifted his glass. "It is wonderful news. It just goes to show what a young man can accomplish with discipline and hard work, no handouts, no shortcuts. Danny built this life himself. I looked at my son. I gave him one last chance, right there. To be honest, with them, with himself, with the boy sitting on the ottoman watching all of it unfold, with the sharp, unforgiving attention that teenagers reserve for the exact moments adults hope they aren't paying attention. Is that so? I said quietly. No handouts, no shortcuts. Danny's jaw tightened. Dad, because I have to say, I continued, and my voice did not rise, did not shake. Stayed level and calm the way it had. Stayed level and calm through every hard conversation of my working life, negotiating with clients who tried to shortchange me, standing in hospital hallways while doctors delivered news no husband wants to hear. I distinctly remember signing a promissory's note 11 years ago. $150,000. Below market interest. Structured through Marcus Weller's office. So that a young man who'd just come out of a difficult divorce could buy a house in a neighborhood he loved. For a family he was building, without his in-laws holding the deed over his head for the rest of his life. The room went silent. In the particular way a room goes silent when a truth lands somewhere. Nobody was prepared for it. Diane's champagne glass hovered halfway to her lips. Gerald's face shifted through confusion into something harder, more calculating. Melissa's hand found Danny's arm, gripping it. That's not. Danny started, then stopped. Because there was nowhere for that sentence to go that wasn't a lie. And even in that moment, with his in-laws staring at him and his wife's fingers digging into his forearm, some part of my son couldn't quite make himself lie to my face. Hale Family Holdings, I said, turning slowly to look at Gerald. That's the LLC on the payoff documents your daughter's assistant pulled yesterday, isn't it? I understand it caused some confusion. Gerald set his cake plate down on the mantel with a sharp clink. Danny, he said, and his voice had lost every trace of the warm celebratory tone from a moment before. Is this true? I watched my son's face, 34 years old, standing in the middle of a room full of people whose approval he had spent a decade chasing, finally cornered by a truth he'd let me carry alone for over a decade, because it was easier than facing what it meant about him. Yes, Danny said finally quietly. It's true. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock, exactly. It was the silence of a family recalculating, in real time, every story they'd told themselves about who this young man was and what he'd earned. I felt no triumph in that silence. I want to be clear about that. I had not driven 2 hours in a sweater my dead wife gave me to watch my son be humiliated in front of people who had never deserved to judge him in the first place. I felt instead a strange and heavy sadness, the kind that comes from watching a carefully built thing finally collapse under the weight it was never meant to carry. Why, Diane said, turning to me with something between accusation and genuine bewilderment. Would you keep something like that a secret? Why wouldn't you just tell us the truth from the beginning? Because I wanted my son to walk into rooms like this one and be respected for who he actually is, I said. Not for what his father's savings account could buy him. I wanted that respect to be real, Diane. I wanted it to survive contact with the truth. I looked around the room, at the gold-crested cake, at the topiary visible through the window, at the whole gleaming architecture of a life built on the assumption that Danny had clawed his way into it alone. I see now that it wouldn't have. Danny's eyes were wet. I had not seen my son cry since Ruth's funeral, and even then, only once, in the church parking lot when he thought no one was watching. Dad, I didn't know how to tell them, he said. I didn't know how to tell them that I needed help, that I'd need help again. I thought if they knew, they'd never really believe I belonged here, I thought. His voice cracked. I thought if I just kept it separate, kept it quiet, I could be the man they wanted me to be, and the son you already knew I was, at the same time. I didn't think I'd have to choose. You didn't have to choose between those two things, Danny, I said. But 3 weeks ago you chose something else entirely. You chose to put me out of a room in a house I helped you buy, in front of the very people you were so desperate to impress, because it was more convenient than telling them the truth about who your family actually is. Gerald's face had gone through several more shades of red by this point, landing somewhere near purple. You're telling me, he said, addressing Danny now, ignoring me entirely, that this whole time the money we assumed you'd earned, Was earned, I said, cutting him off, because I would not stand in that room and let anyone diminish the 11 years my son had spent making every single payment on time, running his contracting business, raising Tyler through a difficult custody arrangement with his first wife, working 60-hour weeks to prove something to himself that he never quite managed to prove to the people in this room. Every payment on that note came from money Danny earned, Gerald. I loaned him the principal. I didn't hand him a life. There's a difference, and I'd think a man in your position would understand it better than most. Gerald had no response for that. Neither, for a long moment, did anyone else. Tyler stood up from the ottoman, phone forgotten in his hand, and walked over to stand beside me, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched mine. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. 16 years old, and he understood, in that moment, more about loyalty than half the adults in that room combined. I think, I said, I should let you all get back to your celebration. Dad, wait. Danny stepped toward me, and for a moment I thought he might actually reach for my arm the way Melissa had reached for his. Please, can we talk? Not here. Not like this. I looked at my son's face, really looked. The way I had failed to look, I realized now. For longer than I wanted to admit, distracted by the comfortable fiction that everything between us was fine, simply because nothing had broken loudly enough for me to notice. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago at that dinner table. Something cracked open. Something that looked, for the first time in years, like the boy who used to fall asleep in my truck with his cleats still on. Saturday, I said, come to the lake. Alone. Just you. Dad, that's tomorrow I have. I know what day it is, Danny, I said. The question is whether you're going to show up. I turned and walked out of that house, past the topiary, past the circular driveway, into a night that had turned cool and clear, the kind of night Ruth always used to say smelled like the beginning of something. Behind me, I heard voices rising again. Diane's sharp and indignant, Gerald's low and calculating. Already I imagined, recalculating exactly how much respect his daughter's marriage still deserved now that its foundation had been exposed as something other than what he'd assumed. I did not look back. I got in my truck, and I drove 2 hours north, back to the small house on the lake that belonged entirely, completely, to no one but me. And for the first time since that dinner 3 weeks earlier, I slept through the night without waking once. Danny showed up Saturday morning, alone, exactly as I'd asked. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a long moment before he climbed them, looking out at the water, looking at the shed where Sam and I had already started setting up a proper workbench, looking, I think, for some sign of the anger he'd expected to find waiting for him. He didn't find it. I had done all my grieving over who my son had become in the 3 weeks since that dinner. What was left sitting on that porch with 2 cups of coffee and the morning fog still lifting off the lake was something quieter, something that still, despite everything, wanted to understand. I brought something, Danny said, climbing the steps finally, holding a small cardboard box against his chest like it might break. I found it while I was going through the garage last week. I don't even know why I kept it all these years. He set the box on the porch table and opened it. Inside, resting on top of a folded blue baseball jersey gone soft with age, was a photograph, Danny at 9 years old, standing beside me in front of the half-built frame of what would become the Hendersons' back porch, my very first big commercial job, the one that put Hale Contracting on the map in this county. In the photo, Danny is holding a hammer that's almost too big for his hands, grinning up at the camera like he's just built the whole thing himself. You used to bring me to job sites, Danny said, sitting down across from me. Every Saturday, all through elementary school. I used to think I was going to be a builder just like you. I used to tell everyone at school that my dad built things that would still be standing after we were both gone. What happened to that boy? I asked. Not cruelly, genuinely. Danny was quiet for a long time, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands. I think he got scared, he said finally. Somewhere around college, I started noticing the way people looked at us, at where we lived, at what you did for a living, at the truck with the peeling paint job in the driveway of Melissa's parents' street when I first started dating her. I started noticing that being the contractor's son wasn't the thing I used to be proud of anymore. It was the thing I thought I had to hide, or explain, or apologize for. He looked up at me, and I hated myself for feeling that way, Dad. I want you to know that. Every single time I felt embarrassed, I hated myself for it about 30 seconds later, but by then it was already too late. I'd already flinched, and the guest room, I said quietly, that was a flinch too. That was the worst one, Danny said, and his voice broke on the words. Diane mentioned offhand that it might look strange to her friends if her own parents were staying somewhere lesser while my father had a whole guest suite to himself. And instead of telling her that my father built the walls of that guest suite with his own hands, instead of telling her that my father is the reason any of us have a house to argue about at all, I did what was easiest. I asked you to leave. I told myself it was temporary, that it didn't really mean anything, that you'd understand. He shook his head slowly. But I saw your face when I said it, Dad. I saw it, and some part of me knew exactly what I was doing, and I did it anyway. I let that sit between us for a while, the fog finally burning off the lake, a pair of loons calling somewhere out on the water. I thought about all the ways a man can love his son and still fail him. All the ways I might have made different choices over the years, insisted on being seen instead of quietly written out of the picture, told Melissa's parents the truth from the start instead of protecting a pride Danny hadn't asked me to protect. But I also knew that regret is a poor substitute for repair, and repair was the only thing worth spending what time I had left on. I'm not going to pretend it didn't hurt, I said, because it did. It hurt more than almost anything since your mother died, and I think you need to sit with that, Danny. Not because I want you to suffer for it, but because I need to know you understand the size of what happened. This wasn't a scheduling mix-up. This was you deciding in front of everyone who matters most to you that I was disposable. I know, Danny said. I know that now. Saying sorry isn't going to fix 11 years of hiding and 3 weeks of humiliation, I told him. I need you to understand that too. What's going to fix it, if anything can, is what you do next, not this conversation, not today. What you do 6 months from now, when nobody's watching and there's no crisis forcing your hand. Danny nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand in a way that reminded me painfully of the boy in that photograph. What do I do first, he said. Tell me and I'll do it. First, I said, you tell Melissa and her parents the whole truth, in your own words, without me standing there to soften it or explain it for you. Not because I want you punished further, because you owe it to yourself to stop being a man who needs his father to carry the hard conversations for him. Okay, second, I said, the note stays exactly as it's always been, a loan, between a father and his son, paid back on schedule, same as any other 11 years. I'm not forgiving the balance. I'm not turning it into a gift, and I'm not asking for it back early either. You earned every payment you've made, and you'll earn the rest the same way. That part doesn't change. Okay, Danny said again, and something in his shoulders loosened slightly, as though he'd expected me to demand something crueler and was bracing against a blow that never landed. And third, I said, you start showing up. Not for holidays. Not for photo op dinners, where your father-in-law can perform generosity for an audience. I mean, you call me because you want to hear my voice, not because you need something. You bring Tyler up here on weekends so I can teach him what I taught you, back before you decided that was something to be embarrassed about. You come stand in that shed with Sam and me sometime and pick up a hammer again. If there's still any part of that 9-year-old boy left in you who wanted to build things that would still be standing after we were both gone. Danny looked out at the lake for a long moment, and when he turned back to me, there were fresh tears on his face, but his voice, when it came, was steadier than I'd heard it in years. I'd like that, he said. I'd like that more than almost anything. We didn't hug that morning. I want to be honest about that. Because these stories like to wrap themselves up too neatly, and I don't believe 11 years of quiet erosion gets repaired with a single embrace on a porch, no matter how good that embrace might feel in the moment. What we did instead was sit together for another hour, mostly in silence, watching the loons, finishing our coffee, two men who had a long road back to each other and had, for the first time in longer than either of us wanted to admit, actually started walking it. What happened after that, I'll tell you plainly, because I think the truth of slow repair matters more than any dramatic gesture ever could. Danny told Melissa everything that same week, sitting her down without me there to witness it the way I'd asked. She was angry at first, not at the loan itself, she told me later, when she finally called to apologize, but at having been kept in the dark about something so foundational to the life she thought she understood. I married a man I thought I knew completely, she said, her voice small over the phone. And I found out I only knew the parts he let me see. That's not really your fault, Robert. I think it's mine too, for never asking harder questions about a house that came together a little too easily for two people who'd just been through a divorce and a modest wedding. It was the first time in 11 years Melissa had ever spoken to me like I was a whole person rather than a background feature of her husband's life, and I found, to my own surprise, that I appreciated her honesty more than I'd expected to. Gerald never called. Diane sent one stiff, carefully worded card a month later, thanking me for my generosity toward the family. Language so bloodless it told me everything I needed to know about how little had actually shifted in the Ashford household. I didn't need their approval. I had stopped needing it, I realized, somewhere around the moment I drove away from that circular driveway for the last time. Some people spend their whole lives building walls out of the things they're afraid other people will discover about them, and there is nothing a stranger from outside can do to tear those walls down. Only the people inside the house can choose to let the light in. Tyler was different. Tyler started coming up to the lake almost every other weekend that summer, first with Danny, and eventually, once he got his learner's permit, driving himself the last 20 minutes from the highway exit with a nervous, proud grin on his face. The first time he pulled into the gravel driveway alone, he and Sam hit it off immediately, two young men, a generation apart from each other but bound by the same quiet hunger to build something real with their hands in a world that increasingly told them nothing they made mattered unless it existed on a screen. By August, the three of us had built a proper dock together, out past the reeds, sturdy enough that Tyler liked to say, with the particular seriousness only a 16-year-old can summon, that it would outlast all of us. That's the whole point, isn't it? Grandpa, he said one evening, the three of us sitting on the end of that dock with our feet in the water, the sky doing that long, slow burn from orange to purple that only happens over water in late summer. Building something that outlasts you, that's what you always did, even when nobody was paying attention. I looked at that boy, 16 years old, already understanding something it had taken his own father 3 decades and a very public humiliation to learn, and I thought about Ruth, and how much she would have loved to hear her grandson say a thing like that, unprompted, sitting on a dock he'd helped build with his own hands. That's exactly the point, Ty, I said. Most people spend their whole lives building things to be seen. The trick is learning to build things that are simply true, whether anyone's watching or not. Danny kept his promise, mostly. Mostly, because I want to be honest, repair is not a straight line, and there were setbacks. He missed 2 weekends that fall for work trips he could have rescheduled, and I told him so, plainly, without softening it, and he apologized and didn't miss another one for the rest of the year. He brought Tyler up for Thanksgiving instead of driving to Charleston for the Ashfords' elaborate spread, a choice that cost him something with Melissa's family. I know, though Melissa herself came too, and helped me carve a turkey in a kitchen half the size of her parents', and told me afterward, quietly, by the sink, that it was the best Thanksgiving she could remember having in years, precisely because nobody there was performing for anybody else. Walt came by that December with a bottle of something he'd been saving, and we sat on the porch in coats, watching our breath fog in the cold, the lake half frozen at the edges. Told you, he said, raising his glass. You're a stubborn old fool, but you're not wrong very often. I got lucky, I said. Danny could have doubled down. Plenty of men do, when they're caught. Some men are just waiting for somebody to hold up a mirror, Walt said. Doesn't mean it was easy for you to be the one holding it. He wasn't wrong about that either. There were nights that fall when I sat alone on that porch, the shed dark and quiet behind me, and let myself feel the full weight of everything it had cost to walk into that celebration dinner and tell the truth in front of everyone. The risk that Danny might have chosen his in-laws' approval over his own father, that he might have let me walk out of that house and never come find me at all. I had gambled something enormous on the hope that there was still enough of my son left, underneath 11 years of quiet flinching, to choose honesty when it finally mattered. I didn't know, walking up those steps that Saturday morning with the box under his arm, whether that gamble had paid off. I only knew I couldn't keep living a smaller life to protect a version of my son that had already stopped existing. The following spring, almost exactly a year after that dinner where Danny told me to pack my bags, he asked if he could bring something up to the lake house. I told him, of course, thinking it might be another box of old photographs, another piece of the past he wanted to lay carefully back down between us. Instead, he arrived with a single sheet of paper, a refinancing document, drawn up through Marcus's office, converting the last remaining balance of the private note into a standard bank mortgage, paid off in full 3 years ahead of the original schedule, funded entirely by Danny's own savings, no help from anyone. I wanted to finish it the right way, he said, handing me the paper on that same porch where everything had started to turn a year earlier, not because I owe you the money faster, because I wanted to prove to myself, not to Gerald, not to Melissa, not even to you, to myself, that I could stand on my own, once I actually let myself be honest about needing help to get there in the first place. I looked at that piece of paper for a long time. Then I looked at my son, 35 years old now, still learning the way we all are, still learning how to be a man his own father and his own son could both be proud of at the same time. "I'm proud of you, Danny," I said, and I meant it more completely than I had in longer than I wanted to admit. I still live in the small house on the lake. Sam has his own place in town now, but he comes up most Saturdays, and the workshop out back has slowly filled with the kind of quiet, honest clutter that means a place is truly lived in and truly used. Sawdust on the floor, half-finished projects on the bench, a boy's handprint pressed accidentally into wet stain on the underside of a table Tyler and I built together last spring, one neither of us has ever bothered to sand out. Danny calls every Sunday now, not because he needs anything, but because, he told me once, it's the only time all week his voice sounds like the boy who used to fall asleep in my truck with his cleats still on. I think often about that dinner table, about the version of myself who sat there and said, "I understand," while something inside him quietly broke. I don't regret leaving. I don't regret the quiet dignity of the 11 years I spent protecting a secret that, in the end, needed to come out into the light before it could stop being a wound and start being a foundation instead. What I've learned, sitting on this porch with the lake stretching out silver and patient in front of me most mornings, is that love without boundaries isn't really love at all. It's just a slow, quiet erasure dressed up in the comfortable language of family. Real love, the kind that lasts, the kind that outlasts a man, has to be strong enough to say no. Strong enough to walk out the door, pack the truck, and build something new, even at 62, even after everything. Tyler asked me once, sitting on the dock with his feet in the cold spring water, whether I forgave Danny for what he did that night at the dinner table. Forgiveness isn't really the right word for it, Ty, I told him. Forgiveness is something you give once and it's done. What your father and I have now, we have to keep building every single week, the same way we built this dock, one board at a time, checking each one is level and true before we lay down the next. He thought about that for a while, the way 16-year-olds do when something actually lands. "So it's not really about what happened at that dinner at all," he said finally. "It's about what you both do every Sunday after." I looked at my grandson, at the whole unbroken future still ahead of him, and I thought that Ruth, wherever she was, would have been prouder of that one sentence than of almost anything either of his parents had managed to teach him. "That's exactly right, son," I said. "That's exactly right."